What is going on with offensive football around the NFL? It's a complicated question. That's what we're going to try to tackle today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work at RotoViz. Stealing Signals subscribers will know that I tried to tackle this question a little bit, or wrote about how I don't really have clear answers in the introduction to this week's Stealing Signals Part 2. Shawn, I was just bouncing some ideas off you. I had been really excited to talk to you about it. You've already had some great ideas as well. There are a lot of layers to peel back to this onion, but I think the onion itself is, I mean, we should probably lay that groundwork, is I think pretty well known, but scoring is down. Offenses are not that fun. I'm seeing tweets like, the NFL's product sucks right now, which is hard to debate. We're seeing a lot of unfun football games. Just a few years.
If you're not a fantasy manager who has games on the line on Monday night, you're turning that off.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a debacle. You don't want to see that.
And you think back just a couple of years to, the one that always gets brought up, the regular season game between the Rams and the Chiefs that went, 52-49 or something. Mahomes versus it was the Jared Goff, but the first version of Sean McVay's offense that was so exciting. We had games like that in the NFL not too long ago, and they were fun. And nowadays, the under is hitting on so many games. Over-unders are dropping league-wide.
Well, you said play the under on Bills Chiefs. You said I can't do it. It wouldn't be a fun way to watch the game, but that game's going to go under, and
it did. Yeah,
and both teams played well. That's actually an exception to the rule that we're talking about in terms of games being well played and exciting. But even a well played and exciting game between the Chiefs and the Bills went under.
Right, a different version of Chiefs Bills than we even saw last postseason, which is, even that element of it is really interesting because this overall trend started mid-season last year. We talked about it last year a lot. I wrote about it in Signals last year. The whole football community talked about it a ton. This, I'm putting up air quotes, boogeyman, too deep shells, and forcing teams to throw more underneath, trying to take away the deep passing attack. I've seen some other really smart X's and O's guys talk about how so much of what created some of the offensive explosion from a couple years ago stemmed from the basically Pete Carroll defense, the Legion of Boom, one high safety, kind of, cover three. The corners have to defend a third of the field downfield, and you have Earl Thomas in the middle of the field who can defend sideline to sideline, and Cam Chancellor, the other safety, coming up into the box, and how well that worked for Seattle, but it worked for them because of their personnel, and it got guys like Gus Bradley and Dan Quinn and a lot of his sort of disciples, a lot of jobs around the league, and we had a lot of defenses trying to emulate this with basically inferior secondary players that couldn't defend sideline to sideline like Earl Thomas can as a single high safety. And it was opening up a lot of space down the field, and how that was sort of a mistake at that time. And now we're seeing the shift back.
Yeah. And on the defensive side of the ball, it's so difficult to do too, because from a fantasy perspective, we tend to focus on injuries to the skill players, but defensive players get injured also. And when you have to have elite players across the board to execute those defenses, you take out a starter, you put in a replacement guy, immediately that changes the dynamic immensely. But then you also have to have, in the same way that they talk about offensive line continuity, and possibly something that's a little bit overstated, but continuity definitely helps. Having your defense play and be sound in their responsibilities and not blow coverages, not make mistakes. When you talk about some of the stuff in college football that's actually seeing a lot more scoring, you have the Arizona Wildcats out here in these Pac-12 shootouts, and their head coach saying, actually, we're not going to be able to be better on defense. We're just going to have to score more points, because with a 20-hour work week to go through these guys, you can't execute your defensive assignments well enough to hold either team down. Well, if you're going to play an aggressive defense at the professional level, anytime that you don't have those superstars across the board and you don't have a team stay relatively healthy, then you can't execute that type of defense.
Right. And so we're seeing this huge trend towards, I don't know if it's, more conservative defenses is the right way of putting it, but it's certainly, been described lately. The very popular way of describing it is this bend don't break defense, where you are sitting back more and taking away the deep passing game and forcing teams to, quote, matriculate the ball down the field, right? Lots of plays. We've talked about this a lot. And I think one of the biggest stats, and I looked it up, there's no easy way to discuss it on a podcast, but I made a little chart of passing ADOTs for all of the league's qualified passers over the last 6 or 7 years. You can find it in the Stealing Signals Part 2 introduction, but it doesn't show a really clear, easy trend, but it does show, I think, a downward trend in terms of, the league's passing depth of, the various quarterbacks. And if we look, just kind of trying to set the stage for this discussion, if we look at some of the league-wide numbers, scoring is down this year. It's at 21.6 points per game per team. You can go back to, all the way to 2011. Every year has been at least 22.6 points per game per team, at least a point per game better, other than 2017, which was right about where we're at now. It was 21.7 points per game per team. 2017 was a year where there was a kind of a rash of quarterback injuries. It was just a down season statistically, any way you look at it, among the last decade or so of seasons. It's sort of hard to explain why that might be. If you look at things like yards per play, it's not down substantially. It's down a little bit. Interestingly, the league-wide yards per carry rate is up. It would be an all-time high right now, but also that's been something that's been trending up. The next 4 all-time highs would be the 4 seasons prior to this year, 2018 through 2021. And those sat at about 4.4 yards per carry league-wide. We're at 4.5 yards per carry league-wide right now. So when you talk about a huge sample, that is a tick up to be an extra tenth of a yard per carry higher, but not massively higher. Passing efficiency is down. Yards per pass attempt right now sits lower league-wide than any season since 2008. It's slightly lower than that 2017 season. That's the only other year that's super comparable. And again, that was a year where we saw a lot of bad quarterbacks playing in a lot of offenses. And, my explanation, the explanation for a lot of people has been, okay, well, they're forcing teams to throw underneath. The question is, how do we play it in fantasy? What do we do? What are the actionable takeaways? I have to cop to not feeling like I have a lot of answers. And there are a lot of layers and a lot of elements here. Some of the teams that are causing some of these trends are winning. We were talking a little bit before the show about Atlanta, who has gone incredibly run heavy, beats the 49ers this week. Part of that is, positive game script. They have a very successful first drive and score a touchdown while throwing the ball on that first drive a decent amount. Their big play was a pass to Olamide Zaccheaus, and then they get a fumble return for a touchdown to go up 14-0. Eventually, early in the second half, go up 28-14 and basically don't throw again from that point on. And you were pointing out to me, after that touchdown early in the second half, they punted on 3 straight drives. And once they started really running, they weren't continuing to be successful, but they were able to, shorten the game and win, and partly because their defense held up and San Francisco didn't play well. But once teams are getting into these positive scripts, we're seeing them really go into the shell because defenses are still not giving them the downfield. And so we're not getting this, put your foot on the opponent's throat and really try to put them away. We saw it on Sunday Night Football, the Eagles against the Cowboys. They get out ahead and they get pretty run heavy. They had one of the lowest air yards totals of the season this week. And I think there's been 21 games with fewer than 150 total air yards. So total air yards is going to look at the depth of the throw plus the overall passing volume. There's been 21 games all season. 12 of those have come just in the last 2 weeks. That's just another stat that I saw, which is feels like we're getting further down this extreme limited pass volume path. Just in week 5 and week 6 here, the Eagles this week were one of those teams. They've also had games where they've thrown 300 or 400 air yards. I think a big part of that for the Eagles was they got out ahead. They ran the ball and they ran the ball effectively. The Cowboys have a great pass rush. I mean, you can't really fault them for that. You can't really fault the Falcons for what they're doing when they're winning games, right? And when they're getting out ahead and going into the shell. So a lot of layers to this onion.
There are. And you mentioned that it's a little surprising that scoring is down so much when you consider that the changes on a per play basis are there, but are not gigantic. And then I would add on to that the tactics on fourth down should be leading to more scoring, not less. So now that we have so many of the teams are using win probability models and expected points models to better understand the consequences of either punting or going for it. And, as people have been saying for years, it's actually very highly recommended in a lot of cases to go for it on fourth down. Well, you extend that drive and you increase your chances of score on the drive. Or if you fail, if instead of punting, you fail on that fourth down, and now the opponent has better field position, then their expected points from that field position on their ensuing drive are a lot higher. So
punts and changing the field position by pinning a team back is how you get, what used to be thought of, I guess, in the olden days of as SEC football. SEC's gotten a little bit more exciting. The NFL scoring is trending downward, the opposite direction. But yeah, Iowa Hawkeyes are the example in college football right now where they play these really low scoring games because they just try to flip the field constantly. The punts are going to reduce the scoring for both teams, right?
And so to be in that environment and have games like this, I mean, it's really frustrating as a viewer. I'm sure it's frustrating some of these teams. We've tried to look at what some of the catalysts are for the changes. And you mentioned the Pete Carroll defenses. I would have to think that another element of this was the pandemic season where you don't have crowds and you don't have that advantage for the home defenses. You have some of these high scoring games. You talk about in that season having, at least for a while, the opposite dynamic that we're having here, where the over is hitting.
So when I went back to the points per game, that season was 24.8. No other season probably ever, but in recent, I just have the numbers here back to 2010, but no other season's higher than 23.3, 23.4. So you're looking at a 1.5 per game higher. And then now we're at 24.8. Then we're at 21.6 now, 2 years later. And it's hard to articulate how big 3 points per game per team is on a league-wide level. That's a massive shift.
Just absolutely gigantic. And it's an unfortunate shift. Because 2020, the games were a lot of fun, right?
Yeah.
But when you're a defensive team or a defensive coach, or you're just any team that's trying to maximize your own scoring and limit the opponent, you're trying to figure out, well, what kinds of adjustments will work in this environment? And we know what adjustments will work. The adjustments that will work are incentivizing your opponent to make suboptimal decisions and to take high, quote, success rate plays that require you to then make a lot more successful plays in total. And, talk about bend and don't break. There's been a lot of recent discussion of Bill Belichick and how much probably he benefited from having Tom Brady. I don't think there's any question about that. But when you look at his defenses and how they outperformed the yardage for all of these years, one of the greatest defensive coaches in NFL history, you can lose a lot by suddenly saying, okay, well, Tom Brady won a Super Bowl somewhere else, so he's responsible for all of this. I mean, Bill Belichick, one of the greatest coaches of all time, understood that you want to make the opponent run a lot of plays and need to be successful over and over and over in order to beat you. You go back and even think about teams that wanted to run the ball themselves and sort of understood how that works. You go back to the peak with Peyton Manning. And one of the kind of funniest things, because especially at that time, it was much more unusual to hear people talk about this. That was during the time period where there was still this very large emphasis on, you do have to establish the run. They bring in Jeff Fisher to discuss, I believe, the AFC Championship game. And they say, how do you stop Peyton Manning? And he says, you have to let the Colts run the ball. Just whatever you do, just sit back and let them run the ball. That's the way that you're going to beat them. Well, now everybody is doing that. And it does create some very, very different dynamics. And one of the things that I would ask you about, and I mean, this is sort of my conjecture with it, is that if we're having a lot of long drives, and one of the things when you go through and you look at the play-by-play in the box scores, and you've watched all the games, and then you're trying to refresh yourself on exactly what happened, reconceptualize how these games played out, and you're seeing 13, 15, 17, 18 play scoring drives. Now, some of those drives end in field goals. And you're like, that's a long time to have the ball, just get 3 points. Or they end on downs at the end. And again, you've now crushed a huge section of this game and no points came out of it all. But you have these long drives, and then you look at the opposing team, and the opposing team will go 3 and out. And then you have another long drive, and you think about what that does to the mentality of the team that had the 3 and out. One of the things here, just to be very specific about some of it, you have this Falcons 49ers game where the 49ers, they give up the game script situation early. They get down 14-0 because of the scoop and score, but then they actually come back and tie it fairly quickly.
Yeah.
They do then give up another touchdown to the Falcons at the end of the first half. They come out in the second half. They throw 3 passes and don't pick up a first down. And the Falcons then go on another long drive and go up 28-14. A very similar situation to what happened with the Green Bay Packers in the previous week, where they appear to have this game won against the New York Giants, but then essentially don't have the ball the entire rest of the game. And one of those drives is a 3 and out where they threw 3 passes. That's the way to play it if you're trying to maximize points. But your own decisions on defense are then going to wash back on how you have to play on offense. Because if your defensive philosophy is to say, okay, we're going to make the other team run the ball and we're going to let them run fairly successfully. I mean, if you sit back to the point where it's a no-brainer to run and teams are picking up more first downs simply running it than they have in the past, those are going to be some long drives and clock-killing drives where you don't have the ball. The risk that then creates for you when you go back on offense is that if you're saying we're going to limit our opponents because we're going to incentivize them to run, even though you know the reason that you're doing that is because it's a suboptimal way for them to play offense, once you get the ball, there's such pressure to not immediately give it back up. It's like we can't ask our defense to play like 30 downs in a 36 down stretch, right? And so then you go out, and even though you know that the reason you're playing defense that way is to force the other team to play bad offense, you've created this incentive for yourself to also play bad offense just so that you can have the ball some. And in a lot of situations, the team doesn't have a very good offense. And so then especially if you don't have Josh Allen, if you don't have Patrick Mahomes, if you don't have these guys who can extend drives with scrambling on third down, and Patrick Mahomes does a little bit differently, but I was pretty excited about this Juju Smith-Schuster game. He has a lot of yards. He has the touchdown. He has the 2 big run after catch numbers. His yards after the catch are actually fantastic this year, but it is based on those 2 plays. In both of those plays, Juju does not actually get open, right? Patrick Mahomes throws 40 times. Juju only gets 5 targets. And on the 2 big ones, Mahomes was back there in the pocket extending the play forever. And finally, Juju is able to break free and Mahomes hits him. I mean, how many quarterbacks in the NFL are going to be able to do that?
Right.
Just 3 or 4. And so from that perspective, so many of these teams, even though they're running a defense in order to force the offense to do something that they think works for them, when they get back there on offense themselves, there is so much pressure to approach it the same way. And suddenly now we have these games that, aren't particularly fun to watch.
You talked about that. That pressure on both sides. One of the stats that when I was looking at all these league-wide trends I thought was interesting was the number of drives per game, per team. It's sitting at 10.9 drives per game right now. I didn't mention it because last year it was 10.8. The year before it was 10.9 as well. And 2020 was the high-scoring year. And there's been rules changes and things that could impact that. if you go back in league history, and this data over at Pro Football Reference only goes back to, I think, 1998, it looks like. Most of the OOs, and maybe because there was more running and more punting, teams averaged more like 12 drives a game, or in the high 11s, 11.7, 11.8, 11.9. As recently as 2013, the average was 12.0 points or drives per game. Most of the years since then, it's been more like 11 and a half in that range. It's kind of steadily declined since that 2013 year in the last decade. But it's almost like it's a different type of 10.9 drives per game right now, where in 2020, it was because these drives were more successful. And I don't know if that really makes sense either, but yardage is down relative to 2020. Let's put it that way. Yards per drive are down. Yards per drive used to be way down in the past when there were more drives. That has increased over time. It has now started to decrease a little bit over the last couple of years, at least. I mean, it's still a lot higher than even a decade ago, that 2013 season I was talking about. I don't know if there's anything there. It's just the things, probably what I'm trying to say when I say there's nothing there is that and I try to think about this when I look at the league-wide numbers, is the stuff that you just described. These little micro shifts in strategy over time aren't necessarily going to manifest in league-wide numbers, even though there is a significant change. And I mean, one of the things I also talked about, this idea of the total air yards numbers, a lot of these teams that are getting really, really low in total air yards and aren't throwing. I mean, when I talk about total air yards, I think that's a really significant stat for passing games, because it's capturing both the low ADOT and passing volume. It's a combination of the two, right? How many air yards on all of the passes. But air yards also measure the available receiving yards or passing yards in a game, not counting yards after the catch. If you have fewer than 150 in an entire game, you're going to need a whole lot of yards after the catch just to have a 200-yard passing game, right? Typically, that band of team air yards is going to be on the low end in the low 200s, on the higher end, getting up around 400, basically. Certainly over 300. And so when we have these games that are sub 150, what's interesting is you think it would be the usual suspects. You think it'd be like the Bears and the Falcons and all these teams, and they've had some low games, but the Bears actually don't have that many low games because it takes some shots down the field. A lot of the teams that had the low games just in these last couple of weeks are teams that have also had games that are up around 400 air yards or higher. I was mentioning to you before the show, but the Eagles had a really low air yards game. They've had some really high ones. Washington had a low air yards game. They've had some high ones. Jacksonville had a really low air yards game this week. They've had some very high ones. The Jets, sort of hilariously, had one of the lowest numbers this week and have had a 500 air yard game, which was the second most in any game all year. Of course, those were different quarterbacks, Joe Flacco and Zach Wilson. And that shift we can talk about on the quarterback level, but it feels a little bit like a random number generator in terms of whether these offenses in a given week are going to have enough passing volume to support fantasy production. And the other part of this idea of supporting fantasy production on the team level that I thought was really interesting as I started digging into all this was quarterback rushing. And a lot of these offenses that have been successful against these bend don't break defenses are ones that have mobile quarterbacks. And I mean, first of all, it's when you think about it from this context of the offenses and the scoring being down, it's not that surprising that the quarterbacks that are distancing and this gap in quarterback fantasy scoring that exists, the ones that are distancing are the mobile ones that are providing a lot of value rushing. Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, they're the ones going into the season that we expected would have the most rushing value. When we were talking about Trey Lance all offseason, I was talking about the difference between really elite quarterback rushing and sort of strong, and how Lance had this potential to be maybe not to Lamar, who's the gold standard, but maybe to Hurts, who looks like the next one. Maybe Lance could be in that range. Josh Allen obviously adds all these touchdowns as well. And the Bills are another interesting team to discuss on a different level that I'll get to in a sec. But you have those guys. You have Kyler sort of in that lower range with maybe Josh Allen, maybe even a little lower than that. But you also have teams like Justin Fields in Chicago. His rushing is providing the only dynamism to Chicago's offense. You have Daniel Jones and the way that they've used his rushing effectively under Brian Daboll in New York, and it's helped them win games despite the fact that they have 0 receivers, right? They just got Wan'Dale Robinson back this week. He's a really interesting name to be talking about right now, but they've had nobody out there to catch passes. They've been winning the game through these methods, the Falcons methods, running the ball and shortening games. And then the Falcons, of course, are another one with Marcus Mariota's mobility, and they've used him on a lot of design runs. He had some strong runs in this game, in this week 6 win that they had. That coupled with the fact that, like Tom Brady last year had a really good passing year. He's not throwing for 300 yards every game in this climate where teams aren't able to throw downfield as much or choosing not to, which was an interesting point you made to me prior to the show. Joe Burrow is a guy that we thought has some mobility, doesn't have a ton of mobility. We thought might be able to throw for 300 yards a game. A lot of those pass attacks don't exist. We had the Cowboys in the past couple of years where Dak would just throw so much. And Dak's been hurt, and maybe that's maybe the Cowboys will get there. Who knows? But we don't have any real quarterbacks that are just racking up passing yardage, other than I guess like Geno Smith is having a few of these games, but even he bounces back this week to a sub 200-yard passing game. And so if you don't have the immobile quarterbacks that can throw for that many yards consistently and that many passing TDs consistently, that also creates the gap at quarterback scoring and emphasizes how important the mobile quarterbacks are, because that does feel like the one element of these bend don't break defenses that hasn't been accounted for well by the defenses, is that extra element of the quarterback rushing. And the read option is becoming popular again. I saw a tweet this week that was commenting on Robert Griffin's, big rookie season when that became a big thing. And then, it was a big staple of when Colin Kaepernick had found a lot of success. And teams figured out how to defend the read option. They're not defending it well right now was the point of the tweet. And I wonder if that has to do with not having as many guys in the box because you are dropping safeties back and all of those things. That's a big part of what the Falcons are doing. It's a big part of what, the Giants are doing with Daniel Jones. He'll pull it and run. Mariota will pull it and run, and he had like a 20 or 30-yard run this week doing that. And I mean, as I think about where we're going next, I guess what offenses are going to be consistently successful? I mean, it's the ones that can find answers even in this landscape. The Eagles clearly are a great example of that, where they have the quarterback rushing element. It also impacts the running back efficiency. We've talked about that. So you see Miles Sanders having a ton of efficiency as a runner. He's a good runner as well, but Hurts helps that. Kenyon Drake this week having a monster rushing game. I mean, the huge hole he had to run through for his long touchdown run, that's created by Lamar Jackson being on the field. I mean, I don't know how many people are really tying those things together, but even, the Falcons, Caleb Huntley being able to run, who's not really an NFL athlete, being able to run as effectively as he is in part because Marcus Mariota is a threat to them run on the edge. You have this across a lot of different offenses. It can't be the whole offense, but with passing down, trying to think about which offenses are going to be successful going forward, you also need a good coach and all of that. But like the Giants to me stand out as a team that have done things well so far. And now they could build off that in the passing game, right? Like you want to start to show other looks. And as we were sitting here talking about it, we've had zero reason to be optimistic about the Falcons, but they've at least shown the ability to win this way or be successful to the extent that teams might have to game plan for that. There's a possibility that Arthur Smith's now able to build off this with the passing game because he has a mobile quarterback and he's shown that he can run in so many different ways with a well-designed ground attack that might have to force defenses to come back into the box a little bit so that he just doesn't have these 15-play drives. And if he is smart enough to then pivot to some play action passes down the field, their passing game might actually have some big plays in it. In terms of the real NFL teams that can continue to be successful, I do think the quarterback rushing element feels like a pretty big one here. A big explanation for why the Eagles are having a great season. Not the only one. The Bills, I set aside, I thought in their very first game, and I was writing about this, I thought it was really interesting how Gabe Davis didn't get a lot of volume downfield and they were throwing underneath a lot. And it went back to their discussions about trying to bring in JD McKissick and then drafting James Cook because they wanted a pass catching running back. I feel like they are the team of any team, and maybe the Eagles as well, that responded to this change in the middle of last year of the two deep shells and said, we need to get better underneath in our passing game all offseason. And here's the ways that we want to do that. We want to get a pass catching running back. We want Josh Allen to work on this. And we want to be willing to take the underneath stuff when it's not open downfield for Gabe Davis and all those things. And the Bills, it seemed like, had a clear intent to be better in that area of their offense early on this year because they used to be a vertical passing team immediately. Like right when Josh Allen and took off and the offense took off in 2020, it was a vertical passing game. It was Allen chucking the ball downfield or running. They have completely shifted to a lot more effectiveness underneath. It's been big for Stephon Diggs. It's been big for the receiving of their running backs, which has typically been non-existent in this offense. It seems like a clear focus for the Bills, and it had been since weeks 1 and 2, something I wrote about early in the year. That's a team that came out knowing what the defenses were going to do and how they wanted to attack it, take those underneath throws. And I mean, no surprise because they're super talented, but they're leading the league in total yards, and they're an offense that is actually moving the ball pretty successfully. I don't know. That's just a lot of thoughts. I don't really have anywhere I'm going with it.
Well, the main thing there is that it still comes back to having a lot of dynamic plays and a lot of successful plays. They wanted to be more successful underneath when they were forced to do that. And you see that element with, the Jacksonville game last year, for an example, being something they didn't want to struggle with again. But when are they successful? It still requires a lot of that explosiveness. You think about the Chiefs, their last 2 games with Kansas City, both times the Chiefs held them down through the majority of the game. And then both times they have explosive plays that actually make the difference for them.
Late,
I mean, Gabe Davis, a huge part of that. And having that element is still extremely important. One of the guys here that we are very emotionally invested in, and it's been exciting to see him bounce back in such a big way. We were pretty optimistic that he was going to be able to build on his 2020 success in 2021, and instead that fell off. You were more optimistic that he would bounce back this year, which he has in a huge way. And when I'm trying to think about why Diggs was down last year and why he's back up, the 3 main answers that I come up with would be that last year he was dealing with a mild injury that he plays through. We know that even when you're playing through injury at the NFL level, that small difference in terms of being at your peak or not, I mean, you're playing against NFL athletes, even the very best players, if they're not at their best, they're no longer difference makers in the same way. The second one would be that he was just very, very unlucky in terms of executing a lot of these things. But I think in some ways, and there's probably elements of both of those that do factor in, but I think probably the biggest thing is that the Bills are a year ahead of the crowd. And I think that you could argue that the Chiefs are too, despite the fact that they haven't been as dynamic in involving their receivers as certainly I was hoping, and I'm sure as they were hoping, as they go into this year. Part of it is just that you have these star quarterbacks. When you have Josh Allen, when you have Patrick Mahomes, then it's going to be very different when you compare that to, more or less 25 of the other teams. But you can contrast where they are with the Bengals and the Chargers, for example, where one of the things that's kind of bizarre when you think about just how bad Russell Wilson has been this year is that if you remove all the sack elements from it, and certainly Justin Herbert has been better from a net AYA perspective, but you just look at yards per attempt, and Justin Herbert's actually below Russell Wilson, right? Because of these relentless drop-offs to the guys. Now, you have the injury to Keenan Allen. That obviously lowers your talent level on offense quite a bit. You've had some offensive line injuries. We know that offensive line injuries have factored into the play calling for a number of teams. If you don't think you can protect your quarterback, you're going to have to do some things to get the ball out more quickly. There's just no way around that. And yet, you look at the Bengals and the Chargers and how much Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert have struggled, even though the teams have been moderately successful. Now, the Bengals, I think, have to be hugely disappointed with their year. But where is that trade-off? Obviously, you have to throw the ball underneath. you have to throw the ball to the running back. You have to have possession receivers who get the job done. When you were raving about Mike Williams in week 5, and then we come out in week 6 and they're not able to do any of those things with him. But I think that right now we're still having too many teams capitulate in the face of the defense and saying, okay, well, the NFL is about matchups. The NFL is about pre-snap reads and adjusting to what the defense is giving you. And you have to take what the defense gives you. And then you have all of these games where Joe Mixon touches the ball a huge number of times. This is the first game, I mean, not surprisingly, because it's a little bit tricky to do, but the first game where Jamar Chase has more targets than Joe Mixon has rushing attempts, and suddenly things really blow up for the Bengals. Now, there's going to be some flukiness to that, and it's just a one-game sample where the Bengals played well and Jamar Chase made some plays, even though he actually did drop a touchdown. I mean, this could be a 3-touchdown game for him.
I defended him on that play, by the way. But
what's that?
I said I defended him on that play. The announcers kept showing the slow-mo and saying that it was such a bad drop. I felt so the DB slapped his hand as he was raising it up, and it was a back shoulder play. And I felt like getting your hand slapped down on as you're raising it late because you're turning to a back shoulder is really a timing thing. Your hands aren't going to get to the position you need them to be. I mean, again, being slapped.
Drop is an aggressive way to put it. Yeah. But
it hit both of his hands. But like he got slapped very hard by a pretty good defensive play that, if we're real technical, is probably PI, but it's not going to get called. It was just
there are a huge number of pass interferences that aren't getting called. I mean, that obviously factors into this as well. But Ben, let them play.
Yeah.
I mean, let's have 4 field goals and a safety and call it a day. Let them play. Let them play.
Anyway, you were making a good point before I derailed you, but I didn't feel like that drop was as on Chase as the broadcasters made it seem to be.
I want Chase to catch that ball, and I want Jalen Waddle to start catching the ball and stop fumbling. But beyond that, big days for those two guys. But you contrast the Bengals and what appears to be finally the decision to, we've got all of these passing weapons, let's use them. I mean, one of the kind of mind-boggling things from a Bengals perspective is that you have to give either Zach Taylor or Tyler Boyd a lot of criticism for the fact that he has disappeared in this offense. Now, he does catch all 6 of his targets in this particular game, not a horrible game for him here. But, I mean, that should be your conservative defense breaker. You've got this guy who's a multiple 1,000-yard wide receiver out of the slot, and you can't use him effectively to beat these defenses that will give you the throws underneath. There's a lot of nuance to what's happening. The defenses are not just saying, we're going to sit back. They're sitting back, but they're also doing a lot of other things to take away what they see as the opponent's best plays. And one of the ways that you can see that too is just you watch the New England Patriots and they take out the opposing team's best player. Missed the game where Amari Cooper catches 4 out of 12 targets. Now, he does catch a touchdown to save his fantasy day. And when you contrast that with a lot of other receivers, you would definitely have loved to have had Cooper in the lineup as opposed to them. But you look at what the teams are doing here, and you contrast the Bengals finally coming out of it with the Chargers capitulating in the face of what the Broncos are doing on defense. And I think it's a pretty stark contrast, right? We talked before the show about these 2 deep targets to Mike Williams, how good he looked on them, how close they were. At one point, does an infinite number of garbage targets to Joshua Kelly become a losing approach to this game as opposed to taking some shots? And if nothing else, giving the officials a chance to call pass interference. Because one of the frustrating things from a fan perspective is that the pass interference stuff, there's just almost no way that it can't be fairly arbitrary. And so we see a lot of defensive pass interference, obvious defensive pass interference not called. And so then that again is a disincentive for the offense to be aggressive. I mean, you're going to get those on some of these downfield passing attempts more often. And at the same time, we also see a lot of phantom defensive pass interference penalties, which is very frustrating for the defense and for the coaches and for the player.
The referees suck.
It's been frustrating.
I mean, and just to go on a quick tangent, these are the same guys that have been the referees for a really long time. The NFL won't make them full-time, won't hire new ones. There's the whole legacy element here. For anyone who doesn't know the background of the NFL referee group, but Like there's like no accountability whatsoever. Several of them are just not very good at their jobs, but they also don't lose their, and they have been for a lot of years pretty poor at their jobs. They aren't going to lose their jobs, but the NFL also won't make them full-time employees. And so a lot of them have commented and back in the push and pull over the last several years that, in the off season, we're lawyers and other things. We don't even, it's ridiculous. It's a multi-billion-dollar organization.
Yeah, I was just going to ask
so
you,
much
how much money is involved in this, Ben?
So much money involved in this. And they're taking literally, I would say, the worst possible approach to getting the officiating right, which is just keep the same people in place regardless of whether or not their performance is dictating that, and then also paying them as little as possible so they have very little incentive, both in terms of potentially losing their job and in terms of their financial situation to care. I mean, it's not totally the referee's fault. It's mostly the NFL's fault, but the refereeing is bad. Anyway,
it's been frustrating to me. I've made some aggressive comments on overtime if folks want to those out. Yeah, so you look at some of these plays and you want the teams to still use their vertical threats, and the explosiveness that we've gotten from the Bills creates a template. Now, most of the teams can't do that. And one of the things that you have mentioned, and I think that in terms of what are we dealing with on fantasy now? So we've always known it's a big emphasis in terms of DFS, understanding ceiling, understanding floor, understanding, how you're going to price individual players within your model and who you're going to put in lineups for any given week. Is the game script is going to come into play, and some of that is going to be determined by quality of teams. Some of it's going to be determined by the style that the opposing team likes to play. But we're entering into a time period where we have the potential for these game script elements to become even more extreme than they have been because of the way the defenses are playing, because of the way the offenses are set up now. I mean, you have some of these teams. One of the most frustrating things for me this season is that you look at these just hyper athletic tight ends who, when they have been involved in their games, you just have to go back and look at Mike Gesicki last week. When they're involved, they're incredibly dynamic. And you think back to some of the earliest work of the fantasy douche of folks like Max Mulitz, who now is an awesome analytics person for an NFL team. The things that they discussed in terms of these big-bodied athletic receivers / tight ends, the touchdown element, how that's much more difficult to replace than the yardage element. As we talk about, how do you do these long drives and then execute when you get down by the goal line? There are so many things here where it's important to actually know what will work and will score you touchdowns. You don't want to have an 18-play drive that ends up with downs at the 6-yard line. At the same time, in order to exploit the defensive approach, we have all of these teams with sort of the heavy rush formations that include multiple blocking tight ends. And then you're going to try and use some misdirection off of that and get these blocking tight ends involved in the passing game. To my eye, a lot of that has been very unsuccessful, at least when they try and go to the pass elements of it. But if you're looking at how are teams like the 49ers so successful running the ball, how are teams like the Falcons so successful running the ball, by putting a lot of run personnel out there, including some of these fullbacks. I mean, you're seeing a move back in the direction of how do we maximize our rush offense. Now, personally, I think that the way that you would do it would be to build a Dick Vermeil type of offense. I still think that in many ways, he was the master of offense because it is an offense that's built to be very explosive in the passing game and to annihilate you in the running game. It's not an either or. It's that we're going to be the best at both, and then you're not going to be able to stop us. Now, would the specific things that the Chiefs did still work today? There are so many pushes and pulls. There's so many evolutions that go on all the time. You have to do the 2022 version of that. But this isn't going to be the end here. And you mentioned that these stats that you're referencing, much easier to accomplish them through 6 games than through 17 games. And so we're going to see if those numbers do hold. But
they're not going to. I mean, like the points are, I don't think points are going to stay this low. A big part of it has been, as you talked about with the bend don't break, teams are getting these long drives and they're not necessarily finishing them. It's been a lot of red zone offense issues. And I think that these teams that are starting to run more effectively and finding answers underneath are going to force defenses to be a little bit different. Yeah, there's so much interesting that you said there. Early on in what you were saying, you mentioned that it's not just as simple as the cover two shell. I mean, I do think the defenses are doing a lot more to disguise things. I think back to Patrick Mahomes' interception on the last play of the Bills game and saw the little dots out there on Twitter. I was trying to look it up while you were talking. I couldn't find it, but remember, in looking at it, like the defender who made the interception was following a different receiver, if I'm not mistaken, and kind of circled back, kind of had his eyes in the backfield, saw that there was some pressure on Mahomes, probably knew from scouting that meant that Mahomes wasn't likely to then go to his deep throw, and basically left this guy free downfield to come back and undercut whoever he was trying to get the ball to, Kelsey, and intercept that pass. But he wasn't even the guy guarding that player at that time. So you can call it disguising or you can call it just a really good individual play. But I think we're seeing a lot more of that too with defenders where they're leaving. I mean, it's almost like they're trying to create chaos in some cases in some of these zones that they're running where they're leaving some guys open to come to other spots. But offenses are going to start to recognize some of those trends. I mean, you look at guys like, Peyton Manning back in the day, and some of the best quarterbacks of all time were so good at setting up defensive backs to move a direction they wanted them to and know there was a route on the other side they needed to get back to. But then whether the quarterback even has time gets back to offensive line play, right? And you have all these elements. Is the quarterback play not good enough? Do they not? But it is going to get better at some point, right? And a lot of these young quarterbacks, I think, are going to get better at that. And a lot of these offenses are designed with RPOs and things to be a little bit more one read, a little bit simpler run game, maybe one pass. Some of these quarterbacks are going to have to get better at being able to manipulate the defenses and come back to their second, third read on the backside and know what the whole field is doing. And we have seen some big plays. And one of the things that I do see on Twitter with some of the X's and O's guys, they talk about the only big plays that are happening are on broken plays. Well, that's sort of the point when you're playing against the zone and the way that these defenses are playing is you do have to have some broken plays. You have to have route concepts that stress the zone and then create the opportunity for somebody to get lost. And you have to have a quarterback who's able to, manipulate the zone and come back to a different read and find that play. And some of that's going to happen. I mean, it can't stay like this forever. It's not just that defenses have figured out offenses, but there are multiple elements. There's elements where probably defensive lines are superior to offensive lines right now across the league. And so some of it is advantage defense overall that, finding those breakdowns in the secondary are harder because the protections haven't been great or what have you.
And you think about Kansas City and all the stats related to them and the third down conversions and even the third down and long conversions. I mean, Patrick Mahomes is probably the best quarterback ever, probably the best passer ever. If you have to have that level of capability and that level of third down convertibility, or however you want to say it, in order to make your offense work, that's not going to be an option for the vast majority of other teams. So they have to come up with different solutions. And I think that you're 100% correct in that those solutions are going to be the rushing quarterbacks in a lot of cases. You have to force the defense to account for so many different things. That's one of the reasons why we were optimistic about Trey Lance. It's unfortunately we don't get to see how that would have panned out. We don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we talk about it too much, but it is one of the reasons why I thought that Justin Fields' game was encouraging. If you put some weapons around him, it could be very interesting because, those rushing plays that he made, that's going to be 100% necessary to make your offense work. And then you take it back to the guys on the other side where you talked about Matthew Stafford, Tom Brady. Why are those offenses struggling so much? And why are those running games struggling so much? They have to be so good and have so many weapons. And if you have some players injured like the Buccaneers have had, if you have a player bust like Allen Robinson has done, then you simply don't have the pieces that you need if you don't have that quarterback rushing and then option element off of your running backs to make the offenses successful.
The Fields thing is super interesting because I saw another really interesting note this week. And not remembering where a lot of these are coming from, which I always hate, but I believe this one came from Seth Walder, who does analytic stuff over at ESPN, where he was looking at the percentage of Fields sacks that are coming later. Basically, his time to throw is higher, or later after the snap, time in the pocket, and it's a high percentage of them. And he was saying that you can't really put it all on the Bears offense. I think only 4 of his sacks so far this year have been quicker than the median time in the pocket. And he was showing some other quarterbacks who a lot of their sacks, like Burrow is one who a lot of his sacks are quicker than the median time in the pocket. He's not getting, you can put some of that on the offensive line. And we've known for a while now that sacks, well, for a while in the analytics community, sacks were, called a quarterback stat. And I think they probably are more of a quarterback stat than an offensive line stat. But obviously it's both elements, right? But you look at like Tom Brady was another one that was in these charts who is not getting great blocking and yet is also having a very low sack rate. And we know that's a staple of Tom Brady. It really doesn't matter who's blocking for him. He's going to get the ball out.
Well, the Monday night game was another perfect example where the contrast in pressure percentage and the contrast in sack percentage between Herbert and Wilson is astonishing.
Yeah, exactly. So it is very much a quarterback thing. And I think it was a fair criticism of Fields that his incredibly high sack rate is more about him holding the ball. At the same time, my thought when I looked at that was like, there's also a third element here, which is that he's throwing to dudes off the street. Like, these are not NFL talents. And he was last year too. I mean, Darnell Mooney, I think, is good, but I think is probably a good number 2, not your alpha. Last year, Allen Robinson was doing nothing. And there was several plays when people were breaking down Fields, per snap, play-by-play stuff, where he's looking at Robinson on like an option route, and he's the read, and Robinson's not even trying to break. He's just like doing nothing.
When he threw the ball to him last year, an absurd number of them at the end of it, like Allen Robinson is just lying on the ground.
Yeah.
I'm like, how did he get on the ground?
There's just nothing happening there. And this year, I mean, he's got guys that are trying, but Equinemius St. Brown and Dante Pettis and those guys, they're also rants that other teams did not want. Multiple other teams in the case of Pettis. It's still on Justin Fields to a degree, but you also have to go back to receiver talent. And that was a really big thing this offseason, the receiver movement and the last couple of drafts, how many receivers have gone higher and the money and contracts that has exploded at the receiver position over the last couple of years. But the big trades this year, A.J. Brown has clearly made an impact on Jalen Hurts. Big talk about Jalen Hurts was he's not very good at throwing over the middle. A.J. Brown catches all of his passes over the middle. I saw that used as a negative for A.J. Brown. He's not a good fit with Jalen Hurts. That's why you shouldn't draft him in fantasy. What we saw the inverse of, and we've talked about this a little bit, is that having A.J. Brown in your offense is how you become good at throwing over the middle. I mean, that's exactly what's happened. Hurts has gotten a lot better in that area because he has A.J. Brown. And it goes to both of them. He needed a talent there, but Brown is also somebody that's going to elevate you. Tyreek Hill has had a huge impact on the Dolphins passing game in their schema. There's layers there too, obviously new coach and everything else, but Hill continues to produce even with the backup quarterbacks, the ways that they're using him and the things that he can do from his own talent level add a lot to what Miami is trying to do offensively. And then the flip side, we talked about the Chiefs and how they would respond. I mean, I think the idea that them getting deeper at receiver and having more answers was smart, was right. The problem is MVS has played very poorly. Juju, for the most part, has not looked effective. Sky Moore, I talked about last week, a little concerned about him getting into his routes. There was a huge sack on a third down before the Chiefs punted in the fourth quarter on what would become the Bills' go-ahead touchdown drive. And then the Chiefs had one more possession. They threw the interception. So their second to last possession, 3rd and 6, they took a sack. Mahomes stared down Moore the whole play. And I put a note in my my Stealing Signals notes because even Romo, when Moore went into motion, pre-snap, circled Moore, said one-on-one here, right as the ball was being snapped. And I was watching the play from that perspective. Oh, hey, that's Sky Moore. This is going to be a fun play. I'm sure remember the play. I'll be interested in your thoughts on it. But I went back and looked at the All-22, and Moore is running 10 yards beyond the sticks before he ever starts to make his break. And right as he starts to make his break, Mahomes basically has been staring at him the entire play because Moore beats his guy off the line. The defender is trailing him where the defenders will sometimes run with their back to the quarterback facing Moore, and he's about 2 yards behind him. And I think Mahomes sees this and is just staring down the play, waiting for Moore to break to the outside. Moore's running basically on the numbers and has room to the outside. There is a safety coming up over the top on the play, and Moore eventually starts his break like 10 yards beyond the sticks. I have no idea what the play was called. I assume it was probably called to be a deeper route. But part of the reason I went back and looked at this is right after the play on the broadcast, they showed Mahomes kind of upset and yelling at someone. I put in my notes, presumably Moore, because that's the guy he was staring down pretty clearly on the whole play. And it did seem to be the case that Moore could have broke his route off a lot earlier, basically beyond the sticks, knowing that it's a third down. He runs 10 more yards. By the time he ends up breaking, Von Miller's free in the backfield, and Mahomes has to try to extend the play and get sacked immediately. You don't have that much time at the NFL level, right? And I think that's what Mahomes is probably telling Scott. This is all conjecture on my part and watching it back and being a very amateur X's and O's guy, but the defender had his back turned to Moore. Moore was beyond him. If Moore broke to the outside at any point, there was plenty of room for Mahomes to throw to Sky for the first down. And if you go back and watch that play, about 6 minutes in the fourth quarter, he's staring at a route the whole time. I'm pretty confident it was Moore's route. And Moore just never makes the break by the time that Von Miller is free in the backfield and sacks Mahomes. And it feels like, when you watch the play, that Mahomes is standing in the backfield for a really, really long time. And he's just like, break, like, cut to the outside. So an unfortunate note on a guy we really like. I still think this guy's going to get plenty of opportunities and things, but you would love to see him take advantage of that when he's the go-to guy on a third down in a key game in a big spot. Seems like the game's maybe moving a little too fast for him, not, recognizing some things like that. But yeah, I mean, who does Mahomes have to throw to? It would be my argument. We had hoped that this group of receivers, that Sky would be more ready, that Juju would be more healthy, that MVS would be, I don't know, good, like good at football, which maybe we should have been more aware of.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a reason that despite not having anybody, the Packers let him sign somewhere else. It's interesting. Those are interesting notes on the Chiefs. I had mentioned in my write-up this week that there has been, because the Patriots fans are spoiled, and because the one massive area that they've struggled is to draft wide receivers, there's been a huge amount of criticism on them for not selecting George Pickens. That criticism, I think, really should belong to the Chiefs, who traded out of a spot where they could have made that pick. Tyquan Thornton, though, looks like someone who's going to be really exciting. We'll probably save that for the next show. But it's really the Chiefs now who look like the team that missed, because Alec Pierce playing fairly well, also at least doing some positive things for the Colts. Sky and McCole Hardman, the only guys who can't get open for Kansas City, but also can't run their routes properly. Hardman is just so hard to watch, where he gets open down the field, and then once he's open, he starts just to wander around. Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do after I get open. He was open deep in this game, and then the pass came right to where he would have been if he continues running. But despite having gotten open, he stops. It is tricky. The Dolphins, you have to give Tyreek Hill a lot of credit. You have to give the coaching staff a lot of credit. There are so many layers to all this. Like you said, it's what makes football so awesome. The coaching is a massive element. Nathaniel Hackett obviously really failing there with the Broncos. I think when we go back to Chicago, one of the elements with these scrambling quarterbacks is that they're going to take more time. They're going to try to extend plays. That's huge because, as you mentioned, where are the big plays happening? They're happening on broken plays. You have to be able to extend the play. That's an issue for these guys who get rid of the ball quickly, like Burrow and Brady and Stafford, where you don't have time to let that broken play develop if you're going to always get rid of the ball in order to minimize sacks. So then you have advantages and disadvantages to the way that you're trying to play it. And as a coaching staff and as a quarterback, you have to figure out, what can we do to maximize the areas where we have the advantage and to minimize the areas where we have the disadvantages. Obviously, teams with Stafford and Burrow and Brady have been very successful because neutralizing those disadvantages has been something they're good at, but it is something that they have struggled with in the early going this year for a variety of environmental reasons. And we'll see what the next adjustment is for those teams. The adjustment for some of the scrambling teams and for a team like the Arizona Cardinals as well, with Kyler Murray, is that you simply have to be able to take advantage of the advantages that you have more. And some of that's going to be on the coaching. At the very least, we see the Cardinals trying to be proactive. And I don't necessarily love to see when the head coach is saying, okay, I'm doing my job poorly, or the part that I consider myself to be responsible for, maybe we can hand that off to somebody else. I mean, I prefer just to be in denial and say, no, I'm going to call better plays, because once you've said I'm going to hand that off, then what are you left doing? Now, we know that running an NFL team is actually a very difficult job. Some of the best head coaches have been simply people who run the organization and delegate these things, but the Cardinals don't necessarily have that in place. Once you start delegating responsibilities, but I mean, you weren't put in place to be someone who's a great leader. So it's like, did you suddenly jump up in terms of your leadership abilities? Anyway, a lot to go into there.
Yeah,
but
he was supposed to be the next Sean McVay when he got hired, right? The guy that can manage the offense and call the plays and do what the Rams had been doing to that point.
Yeah, and that's just, that's a difficult standard to hit, obviously. The Cardinals are at least trying to make some adjustments by going out and trading for Robbie Anderson. Robbie Anderson hilariously made his feelings about playing for the Carolina Panthers and catching passes from Baker Mayfield and all of that very clear in the offseason. At times he tried to play those off as jokes, but obviously they were not. He managed to work his way out of Carolina. Now, Robbie Anderson's been playing poorly enough that this is probably not going to be the solution for the Cardinals. The solution has to be DeAndre Hopkins. But I do want to see teams be aggressive, and that kind of takes us to this question here with Christian McCaffrey. There's been so much. The Fantasy Douche was one of the first and the best, I think, at helping people understand the value of running backs and going through and actually showing that when your running back plays better, your offense is worse because you run the ball too much. I mean, that's where we are with this whole discussion now in 2022, is that if you can run the ball successfully, it actually makes your offense bad. But if you're going to do a lot of that, then I think that you want to have a dynamic running back. It's one of the reasons why it's so frustrating that the Chiefs didn't decide to draft Breece Hall. Address some of the things defensively with structure and play calling. If you're going to have to be so good offensively and you have to run so many plays to score a lot of points, then you need a lot of weapons. And one of the things that people have been talking about for a long time is that you want to build with a star quarterback, but also star receivers. You have to be good in the passing game. That NFL games are basically decided by who is effective passing in the first half. Now, that's not to say that the second half isn't going to be relevant in some way, shape, or form, but if you look at first half passing success, that's going to be the stat that tells you who the good teams are. If you're going to throw a lot of these rushing plays in, and that's going to be true either way, then you need to have yourself a Breece Hall. We see what's happened with the Jets. Well, I don't think that the Jets have necessarily changed so much as you have two very different quarterbacks. Those quarterbacks are then going to dictate what you do on offense. We have a lot of other teams out there who are in a similar situation where they do not have the quarterback play to throw successfully. And so then, especially within the current NFL macro trends, you're saying to yourself, okay, well, we're going to run the ball successfully. We're going to limit the big plays for the opponent, and we're going to hope we win a coin toss game. That's how we win. We're not an elite team. So, I mean, that actually gives us a chance. You want that. And within a relatively small sample, those coin flip games can be very exaggerated. You can be 5-1, like the New York Giants. It doesn't mean you're a great team. And so you end up with those types of games. But then if you're going to be a great team, you want to have all the elements in place. Christian McCaffrey, if he's actually available, seems like a must acquire for all of these teams that fashion themselves as Super Bowl contenders.
That's a well-argued point. It's very interesting. I think he would add a lot to the Chiefs. I think he could add a lot to the Bills. As you were sitting there talking about that, I mean, and first of all, those coin flip teams, Bears, Falcons, Giants, it explains the teams that have been surprising, right? And then the other thing I was thinking as you were talking about having an effective ground game, having actual talent there. I mean, again, go back to the Eagles and go back to, Miles Sanders is running very effectively. Go back to the Bills. Devin Singletary ran well, but also in both those cases, they're getting some of that from the QBs as well. And so, those are the top two offenses in the league right now. And as you were saying that with the dynamism of the running backs, I was thinking it gets back to the quarterback rushing element too. Obviously, the Ravens as well are a team that so much of their ground game comes from the quarterback too. So, I mean, Yeah, a lot of interesting thoughts there. I love the idea that McCaffrey is a must acquire for some of these teams. Like I said, I think the Chiefs are such a logical and obvious, because he's just what they want Clyde Edwards-Helaire to be, but not just good, but Clyde Edwards-Helaire is not good. So you're going from not very good at what you want that guy to be to the best in the NFL at it. He would be a very big element for their team.
When you think about the Chiefs, they're right there with the Bills. I mean, this is a game I really feel like they should have won, especially when you consider that they're at home. These two teams, with some of the things that the Eagles are doing, they've had a great season. They're going to be very, very good. I still don't think that they're really even that close to the level of the Bills and the Chiefs yet. They may get there. But if you're the Chiefs and you're right there and you have the choice of two running, and I'm not saying they actually have this choice. There are a lot of things that go into a trade. But as you just pointed out, it's not just an upgrade. You're talking about the two very far ends of the spectrum, because the things that Edwards-Helaire has not been egregiously awful at, those things still stem from the fact that the Chiefs offense is creating these opportunities. Yeah. Right? Imagine we compare Christian McCaffrey to Marshall Faulk all the time. I mean, this is like him going to the greatest show on turf. I mean, very different offenses, but I don't know.
Yeah, it would be incredible. And I don't disagree with you on the Chiefs and Bills. I was saying the top two offenses by yardage, just because I was looking at that at the moment. But if you look at points, but you're obviously not making you're making more of a qualitative comment than a quantitative one. But if you look at points, those two teams, the Chiefs and Bills, are easily the top two teams right now. Pretty comfortable gap between them and the Eagles. I mean, the Chiefs need answers in the pass catching game. So even if it was McCaffrey's receiving ability, I mean, that'd be so huge. One thing I didn't get a chance to comment on earlier that I want to circle back to, you talked about that idea of capitulating and not forcing the ball downfield. You talked about the Chargers, and as we were talking about the mobile quarterbacks and the fact that's in fantasy led to these offenses. Well, the quarterbacks producing a lot more than the less mobile quarterbacks because they're not putting up the huge passing numbers. But even in the NFL, we're seeing the gaps between the offenses with mobile QBs. I mean, Mahomes is something of both, but not super mobile. And I think it would be like maybe the one exception, but he's also, by his standards, not passing for as many yards as I would expect. Herbert is a great example of that. And I thought I just wanted to emphasize that point that you made earlier. They go downfield to Mike Williams early in the game, and he kind of cuts back, some contact with the defender, sort of hits him in the chest, awkward play, very near miss. The later one was one of the best catches we've seen on the sideline all year, where he is extended out of bounds and catches the ball so cleanly with his hands. And so often when you see that, the player does not have the concentration to have both of their feet on the ground as well. Both of his feet are on the ground as far back towards the field as he can get them, tapping both toes. Just an amazingly athletic play to have both elements. And the one toe is just fractionally on the line. I mean, so close to a huge play there. And it's such a great catch.
I want to make the case for him that if you have the system set up like you have for tennis, where the line calls are automatic and you get that fraction of the ball on the line and suddenly it's in instead of out. If you have that system in place for Mike Williams' catch, maybe that toe actually drags in first.
It maybe kind of had a shot to be in. I was like, I wanted to look at that a little longer. But your point prior to the show, and you made in the middle of the show at one point, was that they should have just kept throwing downfield to Mike Williams to some degree. And what we saw from the Chargers late and into the overtime was just constant checkdowns to Austin Eckler. He ends up with 16 targets. Even Sony Michel had 3 rotating in, and Josh Palmer had like 12 targets underneath and ended up having like a 4.5 yards per target or something. He caught like 9 balls, but for like 45 yards or something. Just a ton of underneath throws, and it was like really early in the down. And you talked about some of the issues with the offensive line and those things, but they were basically dropping back and throwing to the running back by the end of it without even trying to read out the play down the field. That capitulation element, I mean, it's wrong, right? I mean, so there's, again, as we talk about the different layers, one of the things we've been trying to do is describe what's happening, but we can also be critical of what the offenses are doing. When you have Justin Herbert and when you have Mike Williams, and when you're that close on those plays as well, at a certain point, you the way you've always described Mike Williams is even when he's guarded, he's open. You have to take those shots. You can't just keep taking the underneath throws and then punting when the underneath throws are being defended as well later in the game. You talked about how good the Bills have been at that in their matchups with the Chiefs, where they were held underneath quite a bit early, then hit late, right? Gabe Davis had the 34-yard touchdown in this game, late in the game. You have to be able to also strike down the field. You can't just forget about that element and give up on that element of your offense. That's what defenses want. They want to be able to take that away from you and then start to creep up later in the game and start to take away the underneath stuff as well as the game gets tight. Bend don't break early. Bend don't break chronologically, where early in the game they're letting you gain yards. Later in the game they're going to start to tighten the clamps down a little bit. That's when you got to hit them for a deep pass. I don't think it's a surprise that we've seen these good offenses hit for some longer stuff later in games, like the Bills one.
And the Denver Broncos defense would say here, we didn't even bend, right? You had 30 touches, 30 opportunities for Austin Eckler, and he gained 83 yards.
Right. And still had a monster game because of the power of for fantasy, because of the power of high value touches, right? Has a 6-yard touchdown run, catches 10 passes, a monster number of high value touches, gets him to 20 plus PPR points. But yeah, I mean, that's a fantasy point. You don't always need yardage. And that's why, I like to look at high value touches so much and talk about them so much, because if you're catching that many balls and you're getting green zone work on top of it, I mean, it's some of Melvin Gordon's, I always think back to Melvin Gordon, but some of his best years, he wasn't very efficient as a runner and people hated that. Wasn't necessarily super efficient as a receiver either, but he would get so many receptions and get all the goal line work, and you just score a lot of fantasy points when you do that. That's what we're seeing from Leonard Fournette right now. I know you're a big fan of Melvin Gordon's and not of Leonard Fournette, so you might not like that comp, but it is helpful for fantasy, certainly, to have that type of role. We know that. But, yeah, no yardage whatsoever. He was the high-value touch special in fantasy this week, where his actual contributions to the NFL game, not quite as good as his fantasy score, but he was very good in fantasy.
And you want to remove as many of those low-value rush attempts and turn them into short passes in the running game. And so from that perspective, you see the Chargers and the Buccaneers making the adjustments that they can make in so many ways. That's one of the reasons why Fournette has caught so many passes as opposed to them plunging him into the line. And yet teams are limiting the effectiveness of that. But Kansas City doesn't even have that option, right? Patrick Mahomes throws 40 passes. He has lackluster wide receivers, and yet only 5 of those passes are to the running back. Again, no one's going to turn down Christian McCaffrey. But even if we talk about other directions that the Chiefs could go with their offense and, what they might do next season in terms of trying to figure out my dynasty rankings, my dynasty trade values, trades that you and I are offering in dynasty, looking at a bunch of college football numbers over the last week, looking at mock drafts, looking at Devy drafts / 2023 rookie draft possibilities. And I don't think it's any surprise that Gibbs to the Chiefs is a direction that a lot of people see a natural fit, because again, you have a dynamic pass catching running back that could fix all of their problems. Yeah, you don't want to see the Chiefs from a reality perspective burn a lot of first round picks at running back. And yet it's such a glaring hole that people are saying, look, if you have a pick in this 28 to 32 range, and you're saying that you have 16 to 18 guys with first round grades, which is one of the things that you do hear from teams a lot. Pick a player at a position that supposedly isn't worth anything. In a lot of cases is not, but could make a big difference to you, and that player falls because that position drops in the draft for all of those reasons. We'll see what happens there. But I think that teams have to have that.
That's what they
Austin Eckler, and I mean, he's been their offense. And you can say,
describe their logic in acquiring CEH.
Yeah, I mean, the part of it is that if you're going to use a first-round pick on a running back, you cannot draft a sixth-round talent, and that's where his grade was. That's not something where it's like hindsight. It's not hindsight. Yeah. It's not hindsight to say they shouldn't have passed on Breece Hall either.
Yeah.
I mean, those are things we said before.
CEH was not considered a top 3 running back in that class. there was some people, he rose late and people were like, he should be in the top 5, or he should maybe even be in consideration with the big 3, which was Taylor, DeAndre Swift, and who? Akers? Dobbins. And Akers was the clear 4. And then people were like, but I got CH5. And those were the optimistic people,
Yeah, people saying you should look at this guy in round 4.
Yeah. And he went in the first round. Long-suffering Chiefs fan here.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a little bit like when the Patriots are so frustrated at wide receiver. It's like, you guys have had some success. I don't think anyone's feeling sorry for fans to get through Patrick Mahomes.
It's funny because we always say they could have just taken Jonathan Taylor, but also, I mean, setting aside the injuries to Akers and Dobbins, like, we saw flashes from them. Swift has been a smash and would have been a great fit. Like, literally just take any of the running backs that were consensusly ranked ahead of CEH.
Yeah, it's funny because maybe they could get, I mean, if you can't get Christian McCaffrey, maybe you can get Cam Akers, who has apparently taken just like the disgruntled like high school star approach, and it's like, I don't want to play for this team.
He's dropping off the football team so he can skip classes and hang with his buddies. All right, Sean, we should probably wrap up.
Your second contract.
Yeah, we should probably wrap up. I don't know that we're any closer to answers, but it was a really fun discussion. I mean, I guess what I mean is I don't know. I think we have a pretty good idea of a lot of the layers that are impacting offenses right now. There's no easy fix. There's no one thing that's like teams have to do this better. I think it's all of them. Like we just talked about in the great point you made, they need to not capitulate as much and still throw down the field into coverage sometimes. They also need, to be more dynamic. Defenses are probably going to adjust as well to some of the underneath stuff. They need to then find, options off of that. I thought when you were talking about the Niners for a minute, you're going to talk a little bit about some of the motion and things like that, because you're talking about the heavy formations. That has been something that's been maddening. You mentioned the Falcons at the same time. That's part of why Pitts' routes are down, is how much the Falcons go into these heavy formations. His routes were back up in this game in very small sample of pass attempts. They didn't have a ton of dropbacks, but
I was going to ask you, are we going to see more targets from Michael Pittman or more Falcons passing attempts rest of season?
Yeah, that's not great. That Colts,
I feel like you're not taking that as a serious question.
No, I'm not. That Colts game was hilarious because the Jaguars did. I mean, again, another layer to this, but Matt Ryan throws for 389 yards and 3 touchdowns. Of all quarterbacks to have that type of passing ceiling, it was Matt Ryan, and he did so without completing a pass greater than 20 yards until the final pass to Alec Pierce when they were running to set up the game-winning field goal. Jaguars are loading the box, and then they pretty intelligently said, let's take a shot to the end zone and not leave this on our kicker's foot. And their one-on-one coverage outside, Pierce beats him, scores a touchdown. Great play all the way around. Kind of an underthrown ball, but great play all the way around. Great decision. But other than that throw, Matt Ryan, for the whole game, is just throwing underneath. And the vast majority of his completions, he throws over 50 times. I think there was like 10 that traveled even more than 5 yards.
But it's perfect for Matt Ryan because that's
right.
all that he can throw it. I mean, you've got to be aware of who you're playing. If you were playing Kurt Warner,
that's what I wrote.
Season of his career, would you be 20 yards off the line of scrimmage?
Yes.
He's like, I can throw it 3 yards, and you're giving me a lot of these perfect 3-yard passes.
Right. So I called, to get back to your Michael Pittman comment, I called it noise because it feels like every other team has realized to not do that. But Jacksonville defensively treated Matt Ryan like he was a threat to beat them over the top. The only thing Matt Ryan can do is what you just let him do, which is complete a lot of passes around the line of scrimmage and pick up short gains. He goes 42 for 58, and I threw his next-gen stats passing chart in Stealing Signals for anyone interested in it. I'm looking at it now. I mean, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there's like 6, maybe 7 completions greater than 10 yards. The one to Alec Pierce is the only one over 20 yards. Those 7 completions, there was like 8 incompletions over 10 yards. I mean, he wasn't effective 10 yards down the field or more, other than that one-on-one coverage bomb to Alec Pierce. For the most part, just like literally, he had 42 completions. 35 of them are inside of 10 yards down the field, and they're just giving that over and over and over. That's what Michael Pittman got on those targets. I can't imagine any other team is going to play the Colts that way. I don't think Michael, like to actually get back to your real question, I don't think Michael Pittman's 16 target, 13 catch game. I mean, look, I've been down on Michael Pittman. It was a great game. Props to Michael Pittman and to anyone who drafted him and all of that. But I mean, Deion Jackson, their running back, has 10 catches. Paris Campbell finally has his first, reasonably good game, 11 targets, 7 catches. All of that underneath, all very, very low ADOTs. I think all their ADOTs were sub 5. Michael Pittman's was 4.5. 16 targets at 4.5 ADOT. And they're just like, we're going to let you keep doing this over and over again.
Yeah, but you think about, too, how these games play out when each team is seeing the incentives the same way. And you have the second half of this game is a 7-play, 75-yard touchdown drive for the Jaguars. That's followed by a 10-play, 75-yard touchdown drive by the Colts, which is followed by a 9-play drive for the Jags that ends on downs. Then we go right back to a 9-play touchdown drive for the Colts, an 18-play touchdown drive for the Jaguars, and an 11-play touchdown drive for the Colts. I mean, this can work against you too. At some point in that game, the defense should have stepped up and said, let's get a stop.
Yeah, you got to. I mean, I just don't understand how you play Matt Ryan at this point of his career and allow him to beat you with 1,000 paper cuts. I just don't. It doesn't make any sense. There's of any quarterback in the league that you have to let have an option to throw downfield. He's the one right now. He is the one, and it's not close. There's no one else that is even close to as unable to put the ball down the field. We talked about it with Ben Roethlisberger a lot last year, and he retired. But like to just play sort of the base defense that everyone is playing around the league, even in this situation, and then to lose because of it, I mean, that's what you deserved. But just mind-boggling from Jacksonville.
Yeah, exactly. And when you talked about fantasy takeaways, we've got some ideas there, and we're going to have those for you in part 2 of this discussion, along with a variety of strong player takes for our next episode. We hope to have you guys back for that one. As always, it's been so much fun chatting with Ben and enjoying this with the Stealing Bananas community. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me is Ben Gretch. You can follow at @YardsPerGretch. Make sure you sign up for Stealing Signals. I don't see how you could listen to Ben talk about some of those elements and not sign up for that. Sign up for Stealing Lines, his betting project with Dalton Cates. Join us over at RotoViz. Some of the advanced stats that I mentioned, you can get with the new tools that Dave Cabin has put up there. Also, we did our fun Underdog Resurrection drafts last week, Ben. Those were a blast. Those teams got off to decent starts, so that part was encouraging that we were able to use the first 5 weeks and build some fun rosters. The man, the myth, the legend, Connor O'Driscoll is giving you Battle Royale tips every Saturday. If you want to play Underdog, use the coupon code RotoViz for 100% deposit match up to $100. Use the coupon code RVRadio2022 at checkout for a discount to our site subscription. Leave us a rating and review. You guys have been so awesome there. It helps us with the algorithm. We'll be back soon. We'll talk to you guys then.